My husband's favored concubine was barren. To make her happy, he took my daughter away and gave her to the concubine to raise. You already have a son. What's wrong with letting Mian Mian raise a daughter for you? Half a month later, my infant daughter developed a fever that wouldn't subside and passed away that very night. Upon hearing the devastating news, I coughed up blood and died from grief. When I opened my eyes again, I was in the imperial palace. The emperor, smiling warmly, asked me, "Princess Pingyang, which noble young man has caught your eye?" I bowed low and pointed at my past life's husband Gu Zhao's greatest rival, Xie Jin. Years later, Gu Zhao knelt before me, clutching the hem of my robe with reddened eyes. No. Why didn't you choose me back then? In my previous life, after giving birth to twins, I was left weak and frail. I had just changed my newborns into their sleeping clothes when my husband, Gu Zhao, barged into my chambers with a group of servants. The moment I saw the scene before me, an ominous feeling crept into my heart. His beloved concubine, Zhao Mianmian, leaned against him like a delicate willow swaying in the wind, tears streaming down her face. "Sister, don't worry. I will treat the little lady as my own." Hearing those words, I felt as if I had been struck by lightning. She wants to raise my daughter? She's just a concubine. What right does she have to take the legitimate wife's child? A chill ran through me as I instinctively turned to Gu Zhao. He took a deep breath, his gaze filled with resolve. Finally, he spoke coldly. No, Mian Mian can't have children. Without one, she will die. Don't worry. She and I grew up together. She will love the child as if she were her own. You've always been generous and kind. Now that you're raising a son and she's raising a daughter, wouldn't that be a perfect balance? I stared at him, my eyes widening in disbelief. This was the man I had begged the emperor to let me marry? A man who cherished his concubine while disregarding his wife, whose mind was nothing but a cesspool of filth and foolishness. Behind him, rows of servants stood expressionless. They were merely waiting for Gu Zhao's order to snatch my daughter away. I clutched my baby tightly, my eyes locking onto his with an icy glare, wishing I could tear him apart. As he stepped forward, I abandoned all dignity as the noble daughter of a duke and spat at him. "Gu Zhao, this is my child. No one will take her from me. If anyone dares, I'll fight them to the death." Gu Zhao frowned at my complete loss of composure, his tone growing harsher. "Stop making a scene. No, Mian Mian can't have children. What's so difficult about giving her one? As the first wife, do you not have even a shred of compassion? Besides, now that you're married into the Gu family, you belong to us. Your father has long lost his official position. What can he do against me? Even if you complain to him, I am the master of this household. Who would dare interfere? Are you planning to take this to the emperor? Enough, no. Stop causing trouble. You and Mian Mian live in separate courtyards, but they're not far apart. It's not as if you're separated by life and death. If you miss your daughter, you can visit her often. Wouldn't that be the best of both worlds?" Zhao Mianmian, the concubine Gu Zhao adored beyond reason. She was the daughter of a convicted criminal, yet she was also the love of Gu Zhao's life. Watching her shimmering, tear-filled eyes, my voice trembled with fury. "Gu Zhao, it's bad enough that you favor your concubine over your wife. I loved you for 10 years, but what did I get in return? On the very night of our wedding, you took in a concubine. Have I not endured enough humiliation over the years? And now, when I've just given birth, you dare to take my daughter from me? Gu Zhao, are you even human?" His expression darkened, his eyes burning with rage at my public condemnation. "Insolence. Mian Mian is the woman I love. She already suffers from the pain of being unable to bear children. If she doesn't get this child, she might fall into despair and—" I cut him off, my tears falling like a broken string of pearls. "What about me? Do I not suffer? Have you ever considered my pain?" At that moment, the ever-fragile Zhao Mianmian suddenly dropped to her knees before me, sobbing. "Sister, please, I beg you. I cannot have children. I know I failed my husband. Without a child to keep me company, I don't know how I'll go on." With that, She clutched her chest, her face twisted in anguish. Gu Zhao rushed to support her, his face filled with concern. "What's wrong? Mianmian, are you all right?" Zhao Mianmian shot me a weak glance, gasping as she spoke. "It's nothing, just my heart palpitations again. If I cannot raise this child, then what reason do I have to live?" With that, she collapsed into Gu Zhao's arms, unconscious. Panic flashed across his face as he turned to me and roared. "Do you see this? It's all because you refused to hand over the child. Give her to me now, or you won't even be allowed to see your son." I gritted my teeth, straightened my back, and glared at him. Over my dead body, Gu Zhao trembled with rage, waving his hand to signal the servants. I fought with all my strength, holding on to my children desperately. But I was no match for them. Several servants stepped forward, wrenching my arms apart and forcibly taking my daughter away. Pinned to the ground, I could only watch helplessly as Gu Zhao carried my child away. "Gu Zhao, you will regret this." I screamed until my throat was raw, until I could no longer make a sound. Half a month later, my helpless daughter developed a high fever and passed away that very night. I coughed up blood and breathed my last. When I opened my eyes again, I was kneeling in the imperial court. High above me, the emperor sat in his golden dragon robe, gazing at me with a kind smile. "Princess Pingyang, which noble young man has caught your eye?" At this very moment, as I gazed at the emperor seated high on his dragon throne, I slowly lifted my fingers, my eyes landing on the general who had just returned victorious from battle. His name was Xie Jin, Gu Zhao's sworn enemy. Before I could finish speaking, Xie Jin suddenly turned his head, his sharp gaze piercing straight at me. Of course, I remembered him. He had once attended Scholar Song's lessons alongside me. Born into a prestigious military family, he was a true son of the battlefield. Yet, after only a year of study, he had resolutely followed his father to war. Now, upon our reunion, he was no longer the inexperienced youth of the past. With sword-like brows and starry eyes, his tall, commanding presence exuded an air of strength and authority. His features, hardened by years of battle, carried the decisive ruthlessness of a warrior, yet beneath it lay a hint of refined elegance. In my previous life, after Xie Jin's triumphant return, he became Gu Zhao's greatest adversary. Their political views clashed in court, leading to constant, heated confrontations. Whenever they met, sharp disputes were inevitable. Even in private, their enmity was absolute. Merely mentioning each other's name was enough to darken their expressions. At this moment, meeting Xie Jin's gaze, I smiled knowingly. Just then, I sensed a sharp stare directed at me from behind. Slightly tilting my body, I caught sight of Gu Zhao from the corner of my eye. He let out a long breath, as if a great weight had finally been lifted from his heart. Understandable. Back in our school days, I had adored him, my heart and soul entirely devoted to him. He had always been aware of that. Now, it seemed as though we had gone our separate ways. But what Gu Zhao didn't know was that this was my declaration of war. Xie Jin was my weapon. I am Xinuonuo, the legitimate daughter of the state duke's manor. My father, the minister of state, shared a deep bond with the emperor, having grown up together. During the emperor's birthday banquet, when an assassin struck, my father shielded him with his own body, taking a fatal blow. For his heroic act, I was granted the title of Princess Pingyang, basking in imperial favor. However, my father was gravely injured. After resigning from his position, he left the capital to recuperate. Before departing, he made a special request to the emperor. Should I take a liking to any young noble, His Majesty would personally bestow a marriage decree. It was only because my father had relinquished his power and no longer held office that Gu Zhao dared to treat me so coldly. For the emperor, arranging a marriage was a trivial matter. In my past life, I had harbored feelings for Gu Zhao for a full 8 years. He was 3 years older than me, and our story began with a fleeting glance. I still remember that year. I was only 9, while he was already 12. Even then, he stood tall and proud, brimming with youthful ambition. One day, I saw him atop a fine steed, leaning casually against a small bridge. His noble demeanor drew the admiration of every girl in the pavilion. That single glance was like a spring breeze rippling across my heart, stirring waves that never settled. From that moment on, my feelings for him grew, impossible to contain. Later, my father invited the renowned scholar Song to tutor me. To benefit the noble children of the capital, he even established a private academy within our home. And Gu Zhao was among the students. From then on, I often hid behind the screen, pretending to be engrossed in writing poetry, when in reality, my gaze never strayed far from him. His every smile, his every subtle movement, even the way he playfully bantered with others made my heart race. After class, I always found an excuse to deliver meticulously crafted pastries, distributing them among the noble children and ladies. But in truth, it was merely an excuse to speak with him. During those days, I secretly took note of everything about him. The books he enjoyed, the skills he excelled at, the topics he discussed with his friends. I memorized them all. Occasionally, when our eyes met by chance, I would quickly lower my gaze, afraid he would notice my flustered state. And every time he looked at me, he would smile knowingly. I thought he felt something for me too. Yet, on our wedding night, he knelt before me, begging me to allow his concubine into the household. Not long after, my daughter was taken from me, and I died coughing up blood. In this life, if I were to let Gu Zhao go unpunished, I fear my little daughter would never forgive me. When my father heard that I had chosen Xie Jin, he nearly choked on his tea. Nuo, why him? He was raised in the military. Everyone says he's cold-blooded, killing without hesitation. Indeed, ever since Xie Jin's victorious return, the capital had been abuzz with tales of him. They said he had slain countless enemies, a god of war with a heart of ice. But those stories often came with gruesome details. How he personally beheaded his foes, how their blood stained his battle robes, how his mere presence struck terror into the enemy's hearts. Some even claimed he set entire cities ablaze to force surrender, leaving the enemy army in ruins before they finally capitulated. In their eyes, Xie Jin was a fearsome figure, a monster, used to frighten crying children at night. Besides, marriage is not a game. I know you still care for Gu Zhao. You've held on to him for so many years. Before my father could finish, I gazed at the falling leaves outside the hall and gently fastened his cloak. Father, I may have feelings for him, but he has none for me. Lately, there are rumors in the capital. People say he has secretly taken a concubine. Love should be mutual, built on fairness and order. I am not heartbroken. Of course, the rumors about Gu Zhao weren't just idle gossip. I knew the truth from my past life. He had hidden it well, never letting anything slip. But this time, I refused to let him have his way. The moment I returned from the palace, I had already spread word of his affair. Keeping a concubine before marriage was a grave offense. No respectable noble family would allow their daughter to marry him now. The moment I finished speaking, my father slammed his teacup down, his mustache quivering with fury. That scoundrel. He hasn't even taken a wife, and he's already keeping a concubine? Our family will never step foot in that wretched Marquis estate. Besides, my daughter is refined and noble. She will not marry into a den of wolves and tigers. As we spoke, a servant arrived to announce a visitor. Upon hearing the name, both my father and I were momentarily stunned. It was Xie Jin. He had come to deliver the betrothal gifts. At this moment, Xie Jin arrived at the Duke's residence, leading over 100 attendants dressed in luxurious clothing. The grand procession was truly a sight to behold. More than 100 chests of betrothal gifts made for an impressive display. It was said that on his way here, crowds gathered to watch, exclaiming that they had never seen such a magnificent offering. Even my father, who had witnessed countless grand occasions, was momentarily stunned when he saw the vast number of attendants carrying the overflowing betrothal chests. Among the gifts were large, lustrous pearls from the Eastern Sea, gleaming with an enchanting radiance. There were thousand-year-old ginseng roots from the High Ridge region, perfectly intact, exuding a rich fragrance. Exquisite brocades from Shu, vibrant in color with lifelike patterns, added to the opulence. And most remarkably, there were rare luminous pearls from the southern sea, crystal clear, like fallen stars gracing the mortal world. My father, overwhelmed by the dazzling treasures, could hardly believe his eyes. He gasped in amazement, exclaiming, "These gifts are truly priceless. General Xie, you've put great thought into this." Xie Jin bowed respectfully and replied, "My father has long admired you, uncle. These are merely humble gifts, unworthy of mention. Besides, Nuo is my fiancée. How could I treat her with anything less than the utmost sincerity? I hope you will not find them lacking." Hiding behind a screen, I watched as my father exchanged pleasantries with him. It was rather strange. Without his battle armor, dressed in a dark embroidered robe, Xiejin no longer resembled a bloodthirsty warlord. Instead, he exuded the grace of a refined gentleman, warm and composed. Schwanger, upon seeing the grand betrothal gifts, was so overjoyed that she danced around excitedly. "Miss, for General Xie to bring such an extravagant dowry, he must truly cherish you. My mother always said that if you want to know whether a man respects and values his wife, just look at the betrothal gifts. That's the best measure, at least 70 to 80% accurate." Seeing her so animated, I quickly stuffed a piece of osmanthus cake into her mouth and pulled her back to my courtyard. Just as I was about to speak, a maid rushed in, her voice filled with urgency. "Miss, this is bad. Young Master Gu from the Marquis's residence is here. He looks furious. This does not bode well." Upon hearing this, I already had a good idea of what was happening. For him to arrive in such a huff, Zhao Mianmian was surely involved. Whenever it concerned her, the usually composed and rational Gu Zhao would lose his wits and act out of character. Yet if I were to die, he wouldn't even spare a single tear. True love could be discerned from one's words and actions. I called for Schwanger to fetch my cloak and then instructed the servants to invite Gu Zhao to meet me in the rear hall. At that moment, my father was still engaged in pleasant conversation with Xie Jin in the front hall. Handling someone like Gu Zhao was not difficult for me. Before long, he arrived as expected. The moment he saw me, his voice was laced with mockery. "So, you've really latched on a power, haven't you? I once thought the Duke's legitimate daughter, Shen Nuo, was dignified, gentle, and reasonable. Who knew that now, emboldened by Xiejin's backing, you would turn so unscrupulous? I've already investigated. The rumors about me keeping a mistress in the capital were all spread by you. Shen Nuo, why are you so intent on tarnishing my reputation?" Hearing this, I couldn't help but chuckle. Leisurely, I took a sip of tea before replying in an unhurried tone. "They say, if one does not wish to be known, one should not have done it in the first place. Young Master Gu, if you're truly innocent, why fear others knowing? And if you love her so deeply, why relegate her to the status of a mere concubine? TSK, those who dare to act should also dare to take responsibility. Have you forgotten that, Gu Zhao?" His expression darkened instantly. Leaning in close, he stared at me with undisguised disdain. "Shen Nuo, don't think that exposing my relationship with her will make me regard you any differently. I have never loved you. The handkerchiefs you gifted me, I either discarded them or gave them to my servants. Mian is the love of my life. No one can replace her, if not for the fact that she is...
Yes.
If not for the fact that she was the daughter of a convicted criminal, he would have already married her with a grand procession. Yet Gu Zhao didn't even dare to try. Could his so-called love truly withstand the test of time? As he fell into a stunned silence, I simply sat back, nonchalantly enjoying my pastries while watching him with detached amusement. Yes, I spread the rumors. What can you do about it? Report me to the authorities? Beat me? Post a public notice. Seeing his fists clenched tightly, I met his gaze fearlessly. It turned out that falling out of love was a matter of mere moments. Before, I never dared to look directly at him. Even before our eyes met, I would blush and shyly avert my gaze. But now, I stared at him openly, with nothing left in my eyes but hatred. I hated that as my husband, he couldn't even uphold the most basic respect. Just because his concubine was barren, my child had to be given away? Gu Zhao, the only thing I feel for you now is hatred. My cold, resentful gaze seemed to infuriate him even more. Just as he smashed the teacup and reached for my shoulder in a fit of rage, a fist sent him crashing to the ground. Shun Nuonuo is under my protection. Got it?
It was Xiejin.
That day, I didn't know how their confrontation ended. I only knew that Gu Zhao arrived in pristine white robes, and left with half of them drenched in blood. As for Xiejin, he had taken a few punches himself, his face bruised and swollen. While applying medicine to his wounds, I looked at his silent expression and sighed. Why bother? Hearing this, he lifted his gaze to meet mine. His deep, unreadable eyes held a quiet intensity as he said, "You are my wife. I will not allow anyone to harm you." Such a simple sentence, yet it sent ripples through my heart. Yes, not bad.
He was a real man.
After finishing the treatment, I left the hall without a word. Yet as I stepped out, I could feel a gaze burning into my back, piercing and unwavering. A month later, dressed in a brilliant red wedding gown, I was carried in a grand sedan chair through the gates of the general's manor. The most bustling street in the capital was adorned with bright red silk, a joyous spectacle stretching for miles. People said that Xiejin and I were a match made in heaven. But what I didn't expect was that on the same day, Gu Zhao also took a wife. After bowing to the heavens and earth, I sat quietly on the wedding bed, waiting for my husband, Xiejin, to arrive. Just as boredom was setting in, Schwanger tiptoed over and dismissed the attendants. Once the room was empty, she carefully lifted a corner of my red bridal veil, slipped inside, and whispered, "Miss, I have news for you. Young Master Gu also got married today." But I wasn't surprised in the slightest. After all, my marriage to Xiejin had drawn too much attention, captivating the entire capital. Under such circumstances, Gu Zhao choosing to marry today was actually a smart move. He could sneak a concubine into his household without drawing any notice. I had to admit, it was quite the clever strategy. Seeing my calm and unaffected demeanor, Schwanga was momentarily stunned, then burst into laughter. She leaned closer to my ear and teased, "Aren't you curious about who Gu Zhao married?" Before I could respond, she lowered her voice and continued excitedly, "Miss, do you want to know? He married Su Jianing, the daughter of the prefect of the capital. Gu Zhao's days will be smooth sailing from now on." Su Jianing, the beloved daughter of the prefect, had been spoiled since childhood, growing up arrogant and domineering, unwilling to tolerate the slightest slight. Now that she had married into the Gu household, I could already imagine the chaos that would ensue in the Marquis's residence. While people outside gossiped, the sound of steady, powerful footsteps approached from the door. It was Xiejin. Schwanger quickly stepped forward, adjusting my red bridal veil before standing obediently to the side. As the veil was gently lifted, a wave of nervousness washed over me. I dared only to sneak a timid glance at Xiejin. Under the flickering candlelight, my gaze met his slightly drunken, peach blossom-shaped eyes. His cheeks were faintly flushed, his lips moving slightly as he murmured, "Nonoa, you are truly beautiful." In an instant, an inexplicable heat rose in my chest. Thankfully, Amama's timely voice broke the tension. "General, Madam, the auspicious time has arrived. Please partake in the heirloom pastries." Moments later, Schwanger left with a knowing smile, leading the attendants out of the room. Xiejin removed the bright red silk flower from his chest and sat beside me on the wedding bed, his hands awkwardly placed, clearly just as nervous as I was. And so, we sat there like fools for a long time. The heavy phoenix coronet weighed on me, making it hard to breathe, and fatigue set in. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, I softly spoke. "Husband, we should go to bed." The moment the words left my lips, he shot up like a startled rabbit. The lingering drunkenness on his face vanished, replaced by an instant crimson flush. Oh no, he misunderstood me. What I meant by going to bed was simply that I was exhausted and wanted to rest early. Sensing my averted gaze, he gently removed my phoenix coronet and said softly, "No need to be nervous, my wife. I will wait patiently until you accept me completely. Tonight, we will do nothing." And just like that, we spent the night in silence. In the latter half of the night, I was suddenly tormented by a nightmare. In the dream, my poor daughter was cruelly taken away by Gu Zhao, her cries piercing my heart like daggers. Tears unknowingly soaked my pillow as I murmured, "No, no, please don't take her away. Gu Zhao, I hate you." But unlike all the times I had woken up from nightmares before, this time, someone responded to me. A strong, warm embrace pulled me tightly in. Half asleep, I clung to the fabric of the person beside me and, for the first time in a long while, slept soundly. The next morning, I awoke to find the sun already high in the sky. Staring at the unfamiliar general's residence and the unfamiliar faces around me, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Just then, Shuang arrived, carrying a basin of warm water. Seeing me awake, she happily helped me freshen up. Miss, you finally woke up. The general specifically instructed us not to disturb your rest and let you sleep in. I don't think our general is as ruthless and cold as the rumors say. He always looks so serious, but that day at the Duke's residence, he smiled so gently. And don't even get me started on this morning. Seeing her love-struck expression, I widened my eyes in mock anger and playfully smacked her hand. This morning? What happened this morning? Tell me in detail. With exaggerated gestures, she excitedly recounted how, before Xie Jin left for court, he had kissed my forehead. Under Schwanger's teasing gaze, my face instantly turned crimson. That scoundrel. He promised to do nothing, yet he dared to go back on his word. After breakfast, I wandered through the unfamiliar courtyard, slowly accepting my new reality. I was now the lady of the general's residence. Xie Jin usually stayed at the barracks after court, either training soldiers or strategizing. It was only in the evenings that he returned home. His elderly parents resided in another estate in the capital, enjoying their twilight years. And so, in this vast general's residence, I was the de facto mistress. As I gazed at the empty courtyard, an idea struck me. Schwanger, find a few capable servants. I want to make something fun. That evening, when Xie Jin returned, he found me happily swinging in the courtyard. After dinner, while Xie Jin was in the study, Schwanger brought me shocking news. Gu Zhao's concubine, Zhao Mianmian, had fought with his official wife, Su Jianing. Apparently, while serving tea, Zhao Mianmian accidentally spilled some on Su Jianing. At the time, Su Jianing remained calm, saying nothing. But the moment Gu Zhao left, she and her loyal servants, who had been with her for over a decade, ganged up on Zhao Mianmian and beat her mercilessly. Rumor had it that Zhao Mianmian's face was scratched up like a little tabby cat. When Gu Zhao returned and saw her miserable state, he was so furious that he stormed off to confront Su Jianing. Unfortunately for him, not only did she scold him harshly, but she even had him thrown out of the courtyard. And as fate would have it, he landed right on a pile of dog poop. When Schwanger told me this, we laughed so hard we nearly fell over. As expected, the more you yield to someone like Gu Zhao, the more he takes advantage of you. Only when met with fists and harsh treatment does he learn his place.
See?
That's human nature. Just as the saying goes, at their core, people are base creatures. As we laughed, the bead curtain was suddenly lifted forcefully. A cool night breeze drifted in, carrying a faint, familiar scent of aloes wood. Our laughter ceased immediately. Standing at the doorway was Xie Jin. During my nightmare, when that warm chest held me tight, I had smelled the same scent. Seeing him now, I instinctively avoided his gaze and hastily signaled Schwanger to serve tea. Xie Jin swiftly removed his cloak, strode over, and downed the tea in one gulp. As he drank, I noticed a trace of red seeping from his wrist. Alarmed, I grabbed his hand and pulled up his sleeve. A long, clean-cut wound marked his skin, a wound unmistakably left by a dagger. It was deep. I immediately ordered Schwanger to fetch bandages and ointment. Xiejin remained silent, merely watching me, until I finally asked, "Who did this to you?" He hesitated for a long time before slowly speaking. "It was Gu Zhao." Seeing my stunned expression, the always composed and steady Xiejin suddenly looked a little flustered. Ignoring the fact that I was still tending to his wound, he immediately explained. "Just after court, he ran into my carriage on my way home. Seeing how insolent he was, of course, I had to teach him a lesson." "Did you impeach him? How did you know?" "The letters and evidence proving that he was secretly forming factions, colluding with Prince Xian, and becoming his follower. I was the one who gave them to you." "It was you." Seeing me silently nod, he burst into laughter. He wrapped an arm around my shoulder, his voice filled with undisguised admiration. "My dear Nuanua, just how many more surprises do you have that I don't know about?" In my previous life, when I was pregnant, I often felt unwell. One day, while taking a walk in the side courtyard, I accidentally stumbled upon Gu Zhao meeting with Prince Xian, both dressed in black. I quickly hid behind a rockery. From their conversation, I was shocked to realize that Gu Zhao, the seemingly impartial and upright marquis in court, was actually ambitious and had long since pledged allegiance to Prince Xian in secret. During their discussion, they unintentionally revealed their crimes, selling official positions and embezzling military provisions. Watching them exchange secret letters, an idea came to me. I spared no expense to bribe a servant in Gu Zhao's study, who then revealed the hiding place of their secret correspondence. In this life, on the very night I was reborn, I replicated my previous actions. I bribed that same servant to steal the letters. At the same time, I anonymously shot an arrow carrying the incriminating evidence outside Xiejin's study. However, those letters alone were not enough to bring them to justice. The current emperor is kind-hearted and merciful. After discovering the missing letters, Gu Zhao immediately took precautions and was well prepared to defend himself. He was eloquent and persuasive, twisting the accusation of factionalism into an act of loyalty for the country and the people. But the irrefutable evidence was right there. Even if the emperor didn't fully believe it, he still became suspicious of Gu Zhao. Under the pretense of an investigation, the emperor stripped Gu Zhao of his court duties. Though he managed to keep his marquis title without the right to participate in politics, he was no different from a commoner. In other words, he was now completely removed from court affairs. That was why he flew into a rage and confronted Xiejin. I never expected him to be so ruthless, resorting not only to violence, but even drawing his blade. Just as I finished bandaging Xiejin's wound, his expression suddenly grew serious. "Noa, why do you hate Gu Zhao so much?" Seeing the solemnity in his eyes, my heart tightened.
Why?
How could I tell him that in my past life, my husband, Gu Zhao, stole my own daughter away to be raised by his concubine just to please her, and that I had died and been reborn? As I hesitated, my mind racing to fabricate an excuse, Xiejin unexpectedly leaned closer. The faint scent of agarwood on him inexplicably calmed me. His voice was firm and resolute. "I'm certain Gu Zhao has hurt you before." I froze at the sight of the cold, murderous intent in his eyes. So the rumors were true. Even though he had always spoken to me gently and never uttered a harsh word, he was still the mighty general who commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers. I recalled the academy years ago, where he once wore pristine white robes, elegantly composing poetry and paintings with a brush. Now, on the battlefield, he donned heavy armor, bathed in blood, cutting down thousands of enemies. Seeing me lost in thought, he seemed to read my mind. Without hesitation, he firmly grasped my hand. "Our families have an old feud. His father once harmed my grandfather. Later, my father said revenge is a never-ending cycle and that, as court officials, we should serve His Majesty with devotion, not entangle ourselves in personal grudges." At first, I believed my father was right. But what Gu Zhao should never have done was lay a hand on my woman. Gu Zhao must die. No, don't worry. No matter how many people I've killed, I will never harm you.
Why?
Just because I'm your wife. Many years ago, a child accidentally fell from a staircase and got injured. Just then, a snake slithered out from the grass. When he was terrified out of his wits, a little girl suddenly stabbed the snake at its vital spot with a hairpin. That child was you?
Yes.
Before leaving, the girl told me not to be afraid and even solemnly taught me how to kill a snake properly. Later, at the academy, I recognized you instantly. I think from that moment on, you had already taken root in my heart. Hearing his words, something inside me stirred. As a child, I had been mischievous, always climbing and running around. This was indeed something I had done. At that moment, a hairpin was suddenly placed in my hand. I looked up and met his star-like gaze. Now, it has finally returned to its rightful owner. That night, we talked for a long time. I subtly told him how Gu Zhao had deceived me in the past. Of course, I omitted the truth that I was reborn and the depth of my hatred. Xie Jin pulled me into his arms. To outsiders, he had always been ruthless, but at this moment, his eyes were full of heartache. My wife, with me here, I will protect you no matter what. All right. You destroy his reputation in court, and I'll tear apart his household from within. Together, we'll bring his marquis estate to ruin. Seeing my stunned expression, the always composed and steady Xie Jin suddenly looked flustered. Ignoring the fact that I was still bandaging his wound, he hurriedly explained, I had just left court when he ran straight into my returning carriage. Seeing how rude he was, of course, I had to teach him a lesson. You impeached him? How did you know? The letters and evidence proving his secret factionalism and collusion with Prince Xian, I was the one who gave them to you. It was you. Seeing me nod silently, he burst into laughter. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders, his voice filled with undisguised admiration. My dear Nono, just how many more surprises are you hiding from me? In my previous life, after I became pregnant, my health declined. One day, while taking a walk in a secluded courtyard, I happened to stumble upon Gu Zhao secretly meeting with Prince Xian, both clad in black. I hid behind a rockery and listened to their conversation, only to realize that Gu Zhao, the supposedly impartial and righteous marquis, was in fact a scheming wolf who had long pledged allegiance to Prince Xian. During their discussion, they inadvertently revealed details of their crimes, selling official positions, embezzling military provisions, and siphoning funds meant for the army. I saw them exchanging secret letters and immediately devised a plan. I spent a great sum to bribe a servant in Gu Zhao's study and learned the hiding place of their secret correspondence. In this life, on the very night of my rebirth, I repeated my actions, bribing the same servant to steal the letters. At the same time, I anonymously shot an arrow carrying the evidence outside Xie Jin's study. However, this evidence alone was not enough to bring them to justice. His Majesty was kind and merciful. When Gu Zhao realized the letters were missing, he quickly prepared a countermeasure. With his silver tongue, he twisted the accusations of factionalism into a claim that he was acting for the good of the country and its people. But the irrefutable evidence was right there. Even if the emperor did not fully believe it, he still became suspicious of Gu Zhao. Using the pretext of an investigation, His Majesty stripped Gu Zhao of his court position. Although Gu Zhao managed to retain his marquis title without the right to participate in court affairs, he was no different from a commoner. In other words, he had been completely removed from the imperial court. That was why, humiliated and furious, he had clashed with Xie Jin. But I never expected him to be so ruthless, not only resorting to violence but even drawing his sword. Just as I finished bandaging Xie Jin's wound, I saw his expression suddenly turn serious. No, why do you hate Gu Zhao so much? His solemn gaze made my heart tighten.
Why?
How could I tell him that in my past life, my husband, Gu Zhao, had taken my own daughter away and given her to his concubine, just to please her, and that I had died, only to be reborn? As my thoughts scrambled for an excuse, Jin suddenly leaned closer. The faint scent of sandalwood on him inexplicably calmed my heart. With firm conviction, he declared, "I am certain Gu Zhao has hurt you before." Seeing the cold, murderous glint in Jin's eyes, I was momentarily stunned. So the rumors were not baseless. Even though he had always spoken to me gently, never once uttering a harsh word, he was, after all, General Xie, the commander of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. I recalled the academy years, when he wore white robes, gracefully composing poetry and painting with ease. And now, on the battlefield of blood and steel, he donned armor, slaying countless enemies with his own hands. As I fell into thought, he seemed to read my mind and, without hesitation, firmly grasped my hand. My family and his have an old feud. His father once harmed my maternal grandfather. Later, my father said that vengeance only breeds more vengeance, and that as courtiers, we should serve His Majesty wholeheartedly, not be entangled in personal grudges. At first, I believed my father was right. But Gu Zhao made one unforgivable mistake. He laid his hands on my woman. Gu Zhao must die. No, rest assured. No matter how many lives I have taken, I will never lay a finger on you.
Why?
Just because I'm your wife. Many years ago, a boy accidentally fell down some steps and got injured. Just as he was scared out of his wits by a snake in the grass, a little girl suddenly appeared and stabbed the snake right at its weak spot with a hairpin. That boy was you?
Yes.
Before leaving, that little girl even told me not to be afraid, vowing to teach me how to strike at a snake's weak spot. Later, at the academy, I recognized you at a glance. I think from that moment on, I was already attached to you. Hearing his words, something inside me trembled. As a child, I had indeed been mischievous, climbing up and down everywhere. This was something I would have done. At that moment, a hairpin was suddenly placed in my hand. I looked up and met his deep, star-like eyes. Now, it has returned to its rightful owner. That night, we talked for a long time. I tactfully told him about Gu Zhao's past deceptions. But of course, I left out the fact that I was reborn and my deeper resentment toward him. Jin pulled me into his embrace. The man who was always seen as ruthless now gazed at me with nothing but tenderness. My dear, as long as I am here, I will protect you.
Good.
You will ruin his reputation in court, and I will destroy his household from within. Together, we'll bring down his marquis estate. Upon hearing the news that the emperor had been shot and killed, a large army set out for the imperial city under the pretext of protecting the crown prince. Leading them was Prince Xian. However, just as they reached the gates of a Yangxin hall, a rain of hidden arrows suddenly shot out from within. Prince Xian was struck down on the spot, his body riddled with arrows. At the same time, tens of thousands of elite soldiers stormed out of the imperial city, trapping the rebels in a pincer attack. With no way out, the rebels had no choice but to surrender. At that moment, the gates of Yangxin Hall swung open, and 3 figures emerged. Leading them was none other than the emperor himself. From the moment the imperial astronomer claimed the emperor needed to make the journey in person, Jin had felt something was amiss. The next day, a flood broke out in Jiangnan. Everything seemed reasonable, yet too perfectly timed. That night, when he told me the emperor intended to visit Longhua Temple, an idea struck me. Shedding the cicada's shell, luring the snake out of its hole. At my suggestion, Jin rushed to the palace that very night. He strongly persuaded the emperor to find a stand-in to impersonate him on the journey to Longhua Temple. Seeing Jin's earnest determination, the emperor ultimately agreed. And so, Prince Xian and his men walked right into a trap. Now, watching the rebels meet their end, the coup was effortlessly quelled. Jin and I stood behind the emperor, exchanging a knowing smile. When Jin found Gu Zhao, he was hiding under a pile of rebel corpses, pretending to be dead. Unfortunately for him, Jin, a seasoned warrior, had the eyes of a hawk. As the soldiers cleared the battlefield, Jin grabbed Gu Zhao by the collar and tossed him to me. "I hate wasting things," Jin said. Wife, I trust you'll know what to do with him. Looking at Gu Zhao, who is trembling all over, I smiled in delight. Gu Zhao, I've finally come to take my revenge. In the dungeons, Gu Zhao was covered in wounds. He had endured all 72 forms of torture and was barely hanging on, clinging to life by a thread. Just then, two elegant figures appeared before him. Seeing us, Gu Zhao was scared out of his wits. You. Why is it you two? Su Jianing and I exchanged a glance before bursting into laughter. Gu Zhao, Jianing, and I have been close since childhood. You didn't recognize her because she was away in Jiangnan with her grandfather for years. One night, while drinking together, I accidentally let slip the truth about you and me. She never planned to marry or have children, but just to make your life miserable, she deliberately staged a scene of waking up in your bed, forcing you into marriage. As soon as I finished speaking, Su Jianing spat at him. Gu Zhao, fighting your concubine every day is actually quite entertaining. I just love watching you fume with rage yet unable to do anything about it. After all, my father is the Minister of Justice. You wouldn't dare touch me. Oh, and by the way, the chef at the Marquis' residence is pretty good. I've grown quite fond of his cooking. Gu Zhao's eyes darkened with malice. You married me, and now that I'm guilty of treason, I'll be executed. As my wife, a member of the Marquis' household, do you really think you can escape this fate? Su Jianing adjusted her hairpin indifferently, then pulled out a golden decree from her sleeve. You think I was just idling away in your household? I've long gathered all the evidence of your crimes and handed it to the emperor. He already issued our annulment decree. Oh, and just so you know, I married into your family for the fortune and properties. Using my position as the main wife, I've already transferred all your secret businesses into my name. Such a profitable deal. I don't feel the least bit cheated. Plus, both my father and I each hold an imperial immunity medallion. No matter what, the only one who's going to die here is you. And her. Just as she finished speaking, a familiar figure was tossed into the cell. It was Gu Zhao's favored concubine, Zhao Mianmian. Zhao Mianmian's piercing screams and cries echoed through the dungeon. I remained expressionless. In the next second, I raised my blade without hesitation. With a swift motion, her body collapsed like a withered leaf, landing heavily at my feet. Yet, instead of sorrow, Gu Zhao looked at me with deep affection. No, have you forgotten? Back in school, you personally gave me pastries and embroidered handkerchiefs. How could you be so heartless and kill the person who has loved you for 10 whole years? I never imagined Jin would turn the once kind and gentle Nono into such a ruthless and merciless demon. But no matter what, you will always be my one and only Nono. Nono, back in the Golden Throne Hall, why didn't you choose me? Just give me one more chance, please. His plea was cut short by a shrill scream. I had slit his throat. As his lifeless body slumped, I tossed the blood-stained dagger aside and wiped the splattered blood off my face. Softly, I murmured, "My dear daughter, I've avenged you." Look, the entire Marquis' household is gone. Stepping out of the dungeon, the cool drizzle drifted through the air, refreshing and cleansing. It felt as though a suffocating weight in my chest had finally lifted. With my daughter avenged, I had nothing left to worry about. Seeing Su Jianing deep in thought, calculating the value of the Marquis' businesses, I patted her shoulder. Hey, Su Jianing, what are we eating tonight? How about roasted pig trotters? Or lamb skewers? If nothing else, we could go for grilled lamb slices. With laughter and conversation, the past drifted away like the wind. True happiness had finally arrived. A year later, I gave birth to a pair of twins. Holding my precious little ones in my arms, my heart melted with joy. After dressing them in soft, fragrant night clothes, I refused to let go, holding them close. Watching the chubby little darlings, Schwammer shook a rattle and giggled. "Madam, the general has won his battle and gone to report to the emperor. He should be home in half an hour." A whole family together, it's wonderful. I laughed and told her to bring me a bowl of fish soup. Excited, she rushed off. "Yes, madam." Fish soup is the best. It helps with milk production. Watching her bustling figure, I chuckled heartily. Half an hour later, Siejin finally appeared. After 5 months apart, he was darker and thinner. Yet, gazing at our children, his rugged face softened with tenderness. With red-rimmed eyes, he pulled us into his arms. That night, I nestled close to him, warmth spreading through my chest like spring water. Husband, having you here is the best thing in the world. The next moment, he pressed me down, his rough kisses overwhelming me. Oh, is that so? Wife, let me show you something even better. The end.